Something new. Woo! Everyone in here, including myself, I thank you a lot because it's really been fun. Now, you are going to have some great new techniques shown, and I hope you will pay attention because you are in for a great treat. I have got my notebook and my pen in the back there ready to go.
Okay, ready to roll.
I am. So am I. I guess I could tell you quickly, those of you that are online on 852 now, that is pre-loved. Because somebody traded up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you really have a wonderful price on that. And we do have, because it's National Serger Month, 20% off on quite a few of our Bernina Sergers. We have a cabinet that I don't know, we can't show you online.
I am, yes.
You are going to show it?
I am going to show it.
Wonderful, because I know two people that want it already. Carol, you're one of them. I hope you can find that 53 inches to put it in your room. It's in the 890, which I know is what most people want. So I think I'll just turn it right over to you, and you can tell them more about what's going on with Sergers, okay?
Perfect.
Thank you so
Linda.
much, Pam.
Now watch, don't trip on that cord.
I'm going to be very agile here. Thanks,
very
everyone.
Careful. Okay. Well, welcome everybody here and welcome everyone online. It's great to see you and have you with us. We've just had a really good time the last couple of days. We took a little break because we didn't want, on Thursday, we didn't want all the excitement to build up over 2 continuous days. We needed to give you a little bit of a break. But we are back, and today, this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit more about, and let's see, Nicholas, can you put, oh, there we are. We're live. We're up there, and we're going to come off the edge creatively with your serging. Okay, now we have been spending a little bit of time here, and I know that Linda and the other ladies here that are teaching classes will probably be teaching these classes again that we did over the last couple of days. So those of you that weren't able to join us in person, you can certainly sign up for these classes when they come onto the class schedule. So we are going to talk about coming off the edge creatively and looking at ways beyond what we looked at in our projects. Even though we worked with the L890 machine over the last couple of days, and I know I have absolutely fallen in love with this machine because it's so easy to use. And when you move from one stitch to another, you're not having to try and remember, where do I put my thread? How do I thread my machine? It has, and we'll get to the simulator and we'll work through, for those of you that are online also, we'll be able to show you exactly what we mean by having it hold your hand and guide you through. So, using those L8 machines that we have, are we on the PowerPoint? Okay, we're good. Okay. So we worked with the L8 series machines. This is a brand new series of Bernina Sergers for us. They are top of the line, engineered by Bernina. They have all the Bernina components inside of them. And for those of you that are online, you will definitely want to come in and experience them for yourselves because you find how quiet they were. We had, 25, 30 machines set up in here, and I could still talk as all of you were sewing, and we didn't have to yell and shout. Well, for other reasons we had to yell and shout, but it was not because of your machines. But here, as we work with the machines, there are also some other machines that are in the Bernina line that are going to be exceptional machines. The L4 series has some of the same features in width that we'll talk about in a little bit. Extension tables that are, Linda mentioned a cabinet, which I'll talk more about later, but these machines also have these beautiful extension tables that are already on them, and it helps support your fabrics. So many sergers are just, have a very small area to the left-hand side of your needle, and your fabric weighs down, so this also supports that. The L4 series, the 460 has that as well. And the 450 is also more of what I would call an economically priced Bernina serger. as well as the Bernina machines. So if you're new to serging and you're just wanting to get in and experience the beauty of serging and what it can do and how it can help you, these are great machines as well. With the B64, which is the machine that's next. The B64, all of you that were here experienced the air threading. And what I love to tell you about air threading is that you can thread your machine in absolutely any order, okay? Now, those of you that have sergers already, you're probably like, what? You can thread a machine in any order? Because you know that you have to thread in a specific order or your threads get all tangled. With air threading, you can thread your machines in absolutely any order and introduce threads at any point because of that air threading. But what we're going to look at to start with is that we have several different stitches that we worked with in our project over the last couple of days. I'm just going to set this way so those of you online can see that. And we worked with cover stitch, chain stitch, and narrow cover stitch. So when you look at the stitch that we have here online, you'll see that we have a wide cover stitch that we've placed. With a wide cover stitch, your needles are about 1/4 inch apart. And if you stitch with the right side of your fabric facing up, you will have a twin needle look. This is the side that most of the time you'll find on the hems of your garments. But we also used it decoratively, and we placed decorative threads in the chain looper. And here, by stitching on from or looking at the wrong side of your fabric, you're able to see a very different or unique look to that stitch that you can't do on your sewing machine. So the same applies when we look at the narrow cover stitch, but the needles, of course, as you can see here, are spaced more closely together. And we'll look at these basic stitches and some other ways that you can apply those stitches, along with chain stitching. Now, those of you that are here, what's one benefit of using a chain and a cover stitch when we need to do what? Don't have to use your sewing machine. And is it easy or hard to rip out? Easy, that's right. You can just pull on the one thread and it'll pull the stitch completely out. Now, the benefit of that also is that if you are a garment sewer and you're going, or you do alterations of any kind, you can baste a garment together with that chain stitch. And when you pull to remove that chain stitch, it doesn't leave any imprints on your fabric as well. So when we look at using it for garment construction, you can also use the combo stitches. Now, combo stitches are the combining of a chain stitch as well as an overlock stitch. And by doing this, and we experimented here in class also by moving our needles into different sewing positions. So if we're going to be using these needles in different sewing positions, we have the ability to have and we're going to look at the stitches from left to right. So we have the stitch on the far left side, which is a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The one in the middle is a 1/2 inch, and the one on the right is a full 5/8 inch seam allowance. Simply by moving your needle to a different seam or a different position, moving that needle, we also found we didn't have to completely rethread our machine. We just moved the needle to a different position. That made it super easy and very versatile if we're going to be setting in a sleeve with a 3/8 inch seam and sewing a side seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, as an example. So by using those combination stitches for more of a garment, or you could use it more decoratively when we put decorative threads in our loopers. So let's then move on to using these stitches, the overlock stitches, and looking at some of those stitches as well. So in the project today that we did, a table runner, and we used a 2-thread flat lock stitch. Now, we also had a little heart-to-heart conversation about our resource centers, right? And how we have items in our resource centers and we never throw anything away because we might just need it someday, right? I have one book that I would really like to write someday is I might just need it someday. And all of the different things, the reasons why we might need it someday. So when we have these pieces and small pieces of fabric in our resource center, you can take the 2-thread flat lock stitch and you can join them back together like a crazy patch or use different threads. That's the other thing. You know, when we look at our decorative threads, when we look at our thread, some of them only have like 3 or 4 wraps of thread left on them. But we don't throw it away, do we? No. We might be able to use that for some kind of hand sewing or sewing on of a button. But when you work with those decorative threads, you sometimes have just enough to do a couple lines of stitching. So you can combine those fabric collection that we have along with the different threads. Using a flat lock stitch would give you, again, a different look. Now, when we place and create the stitches that we have here in this flat lock, we're placing right sides of our fabric together. And there you're going to see the needle stitch on the right side of your fabric. Something else that we've done on this particular project is around the entire outer edge of that ruffle. When we used the decorative thread in our upper and lower looper and widened the stitch up to 9 millimeters wide, it actually looks like a piece of trim that's been added all the way around the outside edge of that ruffle. So 2-thread flat lock you can also use, and here in the classroom, we have this sample hanging, but you can see that the quilt that is hanging here has all been completely constructed, the binding placed on, and stitched, all using my serger. I didn't use any sewing machine stitches at all on that. And to piece it together, I actually pieced it together using a 2-thread flat lock stitch. So the 2-thread flat lock stitch that was used for joining 2 layers of fabric together is a 5 millimeter wide stitch, okay? Because I only have 2 layers of fabric. Then when I piece together the columns of the quilt, the long columns, there I have 2 layers of batting and 4 layers of fabric. So now I need a much wider stitch. And here I could use that 9 millimeter wide stitch, which then when I pull the stitch flat, it lays completely flat. So if you're here later, take a look at that and you can feel how flat that is. But then I also used my 4-thread overlock stitch. And can they see me on camera doing this, Nick? Or, oh, there I am. Okay. How about the little camera? Can we see it on the little? Pull it up on your computer. I have to pull it up on my computer. Oh, I have to come out of. Oh.
So here.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so when we put our bindings on, when I stitch my binding in place, and it does not matter if you're going to sew your binding from, we're going to call this the back, we're going to call this the front. Doesn't matter if you put your, doesn't matter if you wrap your binding from back to front or front to back, okay? Does not matter. What does matter is that you always have your binding on the top side. Now, as you can see here, I'm using a wide 4-thread stitch. Depending upon the width that you want your finished binding, that will determine the width of your stitch, okay? But when I stitch it, I'm going to be using a fusible thread. So this fusible thread now is placed in my lower looper. So fusible thread in the lower looper. Regular thread in my needle, both needles, and in my upper looper. Oh yes, and we have those over there, fusible thread. Now when you finish stitching, okay, upper looper regular thread, lower looper fusible thread. Now then, here's the magic part. When you take this binding and you wrap it around to the other side and press it with your Laura Star iron, like magic, dun, da, 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 you end up with your binding all held completely in place. Okay? I love this. Now, I'm not a real quilter. So a real quilter might go, oh no, I'm never going to do that. Fine. That's fine. You can do your bindings the way you want to do your bindings. I just love to do this. Now, the reason that I love this is because when I'm stitching my binding in place, with my serger, my feed dogs are 2 inches long. 2 inches long, much longer than you have on your sewing machine. So that when you're stitching, your binding is not growing as your quilt is feeding. It's all feeding at one ratio, okay? It also helps me, my quilt, sometimes it's very heavy, and those added length of feed dog is going to help pull your quilt through as you're stitching it in place. So the fusible thread is a great thread, not only for adding your binding, but I'm going to tell you a couple of other places too when we get to the 4-thread stitch. Okay? So that's and if you decide to use a 3-thread stitch rather than a 4-thread stitch, the 4-thread stitch, the right needle thread runs right through the middle of your seam allowance, and it takes your seam and it squashes it all down. So if you like to have a very flat binding on your quilt, you use a 4-thread stitch. If you like a little loftier binding on your quilt, you use a wide 3-thread stitch on your machine, okay? So give each one of those a try, but I would recommend the fusible thread 100% of the time. Okay. Now, Nick, can I get back to the... Okay, so we're going to come back to... There you go. Okay, here we are. Let me zip past these. All right, so the binding that we put on this quilt, when I top stitched using a chain stitch on my 890. Okay, so it's just a straight stitch and it looks just like a straight stitch on your sewing machine. Okay, now so many times we talk about how fast a serger can sew, and we go fast, fast, fast. 1,350 stitches a minute, and it's like, ooh, that's way too fast. But with our 890, and by having our Bernina foot control, you have precision as well as fast sewing, because when you tap on the heel of your foot control, your needle goes up and it goes down each time you tap on that foot control. So you have control of how your needles are going to be when you come to a corner and you're wanting to pivot with a chain stitch. You can very easily, you can ease up to that corner rather than like when my husband drives the car, zooms up to the stop sign at 40 miles an hour and then it's stop, right? So now you can ease up to that corner and you can get right to that point and pivot. So here's another way that we've combined the chain stitch and a flat lock stitch. Now this looks very much like a trim, not a serger stitch. So we've placed wrong sides of our fabric together for the teal stitch or the aqua stitch in the middle. And then we stitched from the wrong side using a variegated thread in our chain looper and stitched right next to the flat lock stitch. So it looks like it's a separate braid that's laying on top of your fabric rather than different stitches that have been applied together. And we can do that by using the markings that are on the toe of your presser foot and guiding, knowing where the first line of stitching was made. You can guide the next line of stitching using those marks on the toe of your foot. Now another is where we've actually inserted a zipper. Now this is a variegated thread, of course, and we've taken a piping foot, and those in class, we used a piping foot to make our cording or piping on the front of our bag. And when we use this for inserting our zippers, our zipper runs into the groove of the piping foot, so you can get closer to the zipper teeth. And then, of course, we just wiggle the stitch apart. That's the aerobic exercise in our sewing room, is when you do a flat lock stitch. Okay? There you go. Now this one I look at, and this is the ultimate two-thread flat lock use. Yeah, this is like watching fireworks. So here, Gail Yellen, and we're very privileged to work with some great overlock teachers as well. And Gail Yellen has been embracing the Bernina Sergers and loves the fact that it has that 9mm wide stitching. And with that, you can see that you can run various widths of ribbon in a 9mm up to 3/8 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch is your 5.5. So if, again, you're a quilter and you're wanting to actually seam a quilt together, you would always use a 5.5mm wide stitch. And then the 1/8 inch ribbon was used where it looks more like a checkerboard. So we wove the ribbon up and down in one direction, and then when we came back the opposite way, we wove it in the opposite direction so that it looks more like that checkerboard, gives that checkerboard effect. Now next week, Tuesday, Gail Yellen and I are doing a Facebook Live program, and you can access that through the Bernina Facebook page. It's at 2:00 in the afternoon. So we'll be talking more about decorative work and decorative ways you can use your sergers as well, and kind of have a conversation back and forth about that. Central. Yeah, 2 to 3 o'clock Central Time. And it'll be recorded and then on the We All Sew blog. But on the We All Sew blog, this is also part of a project that Gail had developed for us, and it's a placemat project. And it does show you how to use reverse flat lock and also how to weave these ribbons. Now, I talked a lot about 9mm wide stitching. And 9mm wide stitching is something that no other serger on the market has. And it really opens the door of creativity for you, whether it's using it as a flat lock stitch, or in this case, using it as a 3-thread wide decorative stitch. And when you compare that, we talk about 9mm wide stitching, and everyone goes, oh yeah, 9mm wide. And then in your mind, you're going, I have no idea what she's talking about. I mean, that number means nothing to me. So when you compare that to other sergers on the market, which only can sew at 7.5, you'll look at this sample and see that the red stitching is 7.5 and the gold stitching is 9. So you can see the difference in the width of those stitches on the fabrics. And this is stitching over a wire on strips of foam that the Annie Soft and Stable, and then weaving the basket. This is a pattern by Deb Canham, and she is also a very talented serger teacher. Very, very good. So another that I just kind of opened up and showed you, this is again that same kind of technique, just simply taking your 3-thread overlock stitch, and you're going to be stitching along the edges of strips of fabric. This makes it look like the 9mm wide. By setting your stitches close together, you're going to be able to see that it looks again more like ribbon or braid that was added along the side of your strips of fabric. So let's talk a little bit then about the different kind of thread and also the stitch length that you would want to use. So when you're working with normal weight of serger thread, okay, your loopers will typically take 7 to 8 times the amount of thread than what your needle threads are going to take, okay? So that's kind of a rough estimate. When you're working with a 9mm wide stitch, you definitely want to plan at least 10 times the amount of thread, okay, than what your area is going to be, okay? So when you look at that, you might say, well, when I'm going to be working and maybe creating a set of placemats, you figure how many placemats you're going to do, measure around 1, and then just multiply that by 10. It will vary, of course, depending upon how close together your stitches are, okay? It's always better to get an extra spool of thread than to play Russian roulette with your last spool of thread. And yes, if you sew faster, your thread goes away faster, okay? So when you're going to be stitching, and you're going to be stitching with these heavy threads, you need the heavier the thread, the more space you need, or the longer the stitch is that you need. So if I'm using an 8 weight thread, which is heavier, okay, than a 12, so the smaller the number, the thicker the thread, an 8 weight thread needs to have a stitch length of at least 3.5, sometimes 4, because the thread itself is thicker and you want the threads to just lay side by side. If they're pushing too close together, they push against each other, and that's when they fall off the edge, and you end up with that very messy look to the edge of your fabric. So give it a little space, and they will lay very flat, and you'll have a nice edge. That's also when you're going to be working like on this sample. You'll notice that we have a different colored thread in our upper looper, which is gold, and the lower looper, which is green. So here, by having those 2 different colored threads, it gives you a different look to the edge of your fabric as well. So it looks kind of like a crocheted edge that you would have when you have those 2 different colored threads. Now also, when you're working with your turning a corner, okay? Turning a corner, and Nick, can I switch over to the little camera? He's not paying attention to me. I need to escape, and then I go, oh, your device ran into a problem.
This guy that didn't see the product.
Wiggle the cord, Betsy says. Wiggle the cord.
Oh no, her computer shut down.
My computer shut down.
Okay. We'll be right back.
Take a commercial break. Did anybody want to get some of that fusible thread while we're at a commercial break here? Okay, we're on the big camera.
Yeah. So we just have to let it restart. And it should come back up.
That's the first time that's ever happened.
It's happens. And we're back. So
And we're back.
yeah, you'll have to get your PowerPoint back up.
Okay. Okay. So, ladies, what I'm going to show you is turning a corner. So earlier we were working on our projects and the little table runner, and now what do I have? Okay. All the advertise. Yes. Okay. All right. So that should be the last one. And I'm going to show you a couple things. One, I'm going to show you a beginning and an ending of a seam. The other, I'm going to show you turning of a corner. So when you're going to be, when you start to stitch with a overlock stitch, you have this tail, right? And when you're going to begin and end an area, you're going to insert your fabric right into your presser foot. And let me see if I can can you see that right on top of the foot there? Now this makes, yeah, and this makes me have to sew really good, right? Okay. I'm hugging the camera. And what we're going to do is stitch, let me get the foot pedal. We're going to stitch just a couple of stitches, like 3 or 4 stitches onto your fabric. Then you're going to raise your presser foot, and here, this is where I would typically use my knee lift, so I have both hands that I can hold on to my fabric and to the tail. My needle is stopped up, and I'll take this tail and just bring it around to the front of the foot and just pull it up between the blade and the foot. Then when you lower your foot and you start to stitch, then you cut it off. And can you see how it pulled that tail into my stitch? Okay, and it sealed that off. So now I don't have that long tail that I have to deal with or worry about it actually pulling out or coming apart, okay? Or putting fray check on or tying it, okay? Now, then let's go to the other end. I have to pull my foot pedal out, sorry. It's getting too far into the cabinet. I can't reach it. Okay, so now we're going to come to the very end, and we're going to stitch 1 stitch off the edge of our fabric. See how that heel tap came into play? Very convenient. Now then, we're going to raise our foot, and you're going to slide your stitches away from the stitching area, and you'll flip your fabric completely over. Okay? Flip it over. Flip it over. Then, when you lower your foot, I also like to take my cutting blade and lower it out of the way so I'm not cutting off these loops that I just made. So when I stitch over and I stitch off, now I have the end and the beginning, my stitches are completely sealed in place. Okay? Good one. Now, we got a round of applause on that one. Round of applause. Okay, what was the other thing I was going to show you? Corners. There we go. That was it. Okay. I've got a senior blonde brain these days, so. All right, let me put my blade back up. And we're going to use the heel tap on the foot control. So I'm zipping right along, right up to my corner, and I come to the corner, and I go heel tap down, heel tap up, 1 stitch beyond the edge. 1. Then I'm going to raise the foot And I have this foot that pivots off to the side. This will be magic. Then you're going to see that your stitches form and wrap around these little, what are called stitch fingers, right? So we're going to slide the stitches off of those stitch fingers. And now, because I have this foot swung out of the way, I can see where the needle is going to come right down at the edge of the fabric. Then, when I put the foot back in place, before I start to sew, I'm going to tug on my threads at the very top of my machine. Lower the foot and then stitch, and you end up with a perfect corner, even when you're sewing side saddle. Can you see that? Okay. The pivoting of the foot and the stitching off of your fabric, one stitch, is what gives you that precision in the edge of your fabric. Now, excellent. Okay, another round of applause. Perfect. All right, so let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so I have to go back to my PowerPoint. I have to find it. And let me scoot on down here to my corner. Presentation. Ha-ha. Okay, by the end, we'll know exactly how to get between all of these devices. So now, you saw how easy it was to turn the corner, right? But I was using just regular overlock thread. And sometimes when you're working with heavier thread and you've pivoted and turned your corner and you're starting right on that edge, it doesn't feed as well, like on your sewing machine, right? So if it doesn't pick up right away, you end up with a thicker, a little bubble like on the corner. So what I would recommend that you do is take your practice piece of fabric that you have and use it as a leveling device for your foot. So now you can slide it underneath the back side of your foot, and now when it stitches, your foot is level and it will continue to stitch all at the same rate, okay? And there's something for your feed dogs to grab onto on the back side, all right? So whether you're doing a rolled hem or you're going to be doing a wider 3-thread stitch, for that, you can add that little bit on the back side of your presser foot. Okay, next, this is going to be called Serger crochet. Now this Serger crochet, and I'm going to step away for just a minute and pick this up. This is just thread. Okay? This is just thread. This is 3-thread wide overlock stitching. Same thing like this little bonnet. It is just thread placed in my upper and lower looper. The bonnet is pearl crown rayon. The sleeves are a 12 weight spaghetti thread. And when you stitch, you're just going to be stitching row after row into the previous row of overlock stitching. Now, when you do that, using needle down is very valuable because you have an anchor point that's going to hold the stitches that are right there under the foot. So when you raise your foot to pivot more stitches underneath, or because you can only sew straight, right? The needle down is going to hold it in place and eliminate any gaps or holidays that you would have when you're stitching this. Now, how much thread did it take? Okay. This sleeve, I started 2 spools of 12 weight spaghetti thread. Okay. This sleeve, I started 2 new spools of spaghetti thread. Okay, that's 4 spools of the spaghetti thread. Did I use all of it? No, but I do not want to run out halfway in between when I'm stitching something like this. Now this is super cute on the bottom of, or on the edge of a pair of little girl socks. Okay, you can use it that way. You could also, just as we have done here, and when I stitch to make the trim around the bottom of the sleeves, I always start with a bias strip of fabric and I join it together to make a cylinder. Then as I stitch, I just continue to stitch around and around and around. And this is all I know of physics. The bigger the circle, the larger the circle, the bigger it's going to become. And you get this beautiful ruffly edge when you go around and around and around in a circle. If you stitch completely flat, this does not use any water-soluble stabilizer at all to create this little bonnet. And it's a rayon thread. We start stitching on a narrow casing of fabric. So it's about 14 inches long. Fold your strip of fabric in half. The first line of stitching is right on the strip of fabric. And then each consecutive line of stitching is just into the previous line of stitching. And then as you increase, or to create more ruffles, you shorten your stitch length, which increases the number of stitches, and that's what gives us this little ruffly edge on the edge of the bonnet itself. Okay? Now, don't start this the morning of the baby shower. Okay? Takes 9 months for babies to come, so maybe start as soon as you find out. No. It does not take very long at all. It's just more of a precision, and by using those markings that are on the toe of your presser foot to your advantage, knowing where those lines of stitching are going to, oops, can you reach that? I'm going to toss this at you there, Marty. You can take a look at that. Okay, now that technique is also in the Big Book of Serging. So if any of you are wondering how in the world did you do that, look in the Big Book of Serging and you'll be able to find more information about that. This tote bag is also using that same serger crochet technique through the middle of the bag, but this time instead of just stitching on the air and stitching it into the project, I then took a glue or a coating, which is called Audi-Coat, and you can put that on fabric and make it anything water repellent. But then this is like a glue, and you can place that on top of that stitching. It makes it very stiff, the fabric very stiff, and then I laid the chains, the serger chains, right on top of the glue as it was drying, and then it just held it. They held it in place. Okay? All right. Now, we were talking about total stitch control and our 9mm wide stitch that we have. Now, with this sample, and this was a stitch that someone asked me something about doing something decorative. And I said, well, you know what we can do, because we have total stitch control, we can make an adjustment to the stitch. Now, doesn't this look like two different stitches that have been kind of joined together? But it's all done at one time. So I placed the black thread in my lower looper and the white thread in the upper looper. And I have the 9mm wide stitch. And by using total stitch control, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute, I adjusted the stitch so that instead of the looper threads meeting right along the very edge, it now meets in the middle of the stitch on the top. Okay? So that's why it looks like two different stitches that have been joined together. So now total stitch control is the ability to set the stitches however you want to set them. And sometimes we become fearful when we hear the word tension. Yeah, it's like dun, dun, dun. And The reason we are is because on our sewing machines, they've always said, don't touch that dial. Don't touch that dial. We don't need to touch it. Well, when we come to our sergers, then it's like, oh yeah, go ahead, turn on those dials, play with it. And you're like, can't do it. I've been told no, I can't. So here's what I want you to do. Don't think about them as tension dials. And I've talked about this for years, that if we think of them more as thread control dials, okay? The lower the number, the less control there is on the thread. So it's going to give us more loops. The higher the number, the more control there is on the thread, and it pulls a little bit tighter. So when I did this stitch, this 2-color stitch, I tightened the control on my upper looper, so I strengthened it, and I weakened it on my lower looper. And that's what allowed those threads to wrap in different directions and give me this different stitch. So now you might be like, oh, well, that's great, but how are you ever going to remember how to do that again? Well, in just a minute, I'm going to go to the simulator, and what you can do is you can save all of these different stitches that you create, and you don't have to write it all down and worry about where you put the piece of paper that you wrote all this information on, or find your instruction book. It can be saved right into your machine itself. So now what you can also do is by taking these chains, so you saw on the little bag that has the flowers on, you saw those chains that are there. And what you can do is take these chains and you can iron them flat. And when you iron them flat, they become now a piece of braid, whether it's a chain stitch on your chain side, the chain stitch, or it's a chain from your rolled hem. The chain from your rolled hem is going to be thicker, and it'll be a little more curly because you have more tension and you also have more thread. You have 3 threads versus 2 threads on your chain stitch side. So as you look at these little ornaments, and these are ornaments that Gail Yellen had done, and she just simply used the decorative threads, made the chain, putting a different color thread in each looper gives you a different look and how it kind of twists and spins on the braid itself. So then what you can also do is with the rolled hem is you can edge, and this is something that Nancy Bednar, one of the Bernina educators, has put together. And by stitching over a fish line or stitching on a wire, you can add dimension to a fabric that would be very limp and very loose. What I also like to point out is on these leaves, the leaves themselves are curved, right? So instead of cutting a shape and trying to follow an edge, let your machine cut it for you. So whether it's the edge of a blanket or the edge of a collar, go ahead and draw the line. Then let your machine follow that line. Your cutter is going to follow that line, and then your loops will always be right on the edge, rather than trying to follow a curved edge with your machine, and then sometimes it falls off the edge and it doesn't always get close enough, because you can't push it underneath your presser foot. So try that. That will be a big time saver there. Using your chain also for tassels, it's a great way to create, again, a trim or a braid. You can also take a piece of fish line and just stitch over that fish line with thread and use that as a trim. That looks very pretty too, and add some beads to it. But if you're going to be using a chain stitch from your machine, it would be best if you use the center needle when you're doing a chain stitch. use the center chain needle, and you'll always end up with a consistent chain off. Now I've done this. Now, some of you in here were knitters and crocheters, right? So what you can do is also blend your threads together. Take thread, different serger threads, blend them together, chain it, just continue to run chain, 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 wrap it up, and then use that as your yarn to knit with or crochet with. Okay? Because sometimes you can find yarn that is the right color. Sometimes you can't. Okay? Sometimes you need just a little bit. So just chain it off and use that as your crochet or knitting yarn. Okay. Now on this next little scarf, the scarf itself is just a 6-inch strip of knit fabric. Don't forget those knit fabrics that they have going on the flash sale. Oh, yep, over there, Norma Jean's got it. She's pointing. But by taking a crosswise grain of fabric stretched out and using your rolled hem, can you see on this scarf how the edge is very rippled? Okay, that lettuce edge that's created. You use a rolled hem and you take your differential feed and you set it below the number 1 setting, and it will stretch the fabric out as you're stitching. The thread that I like to use for this also, and they have some of it sitting on the table, it's called soft lock. And that soft lock thread, because it's fuzzier and it's not twisted, is going to fill in between those stitches a lot firmer. They have the full collection, all the colors. Okay, not just neon orange. Yeah. Okay. Now the chain that I've used here, I think it's going that way. So the chain that we used here, we actually took the chain and wove it through. We took the chain and wove it through that strip of black fabric. And we used a rotary cutter that looks like a star, and it's intended to skip every so often, not the cutter you have at home that you've whacked into the side of your ruler, okay? That skips every so often. This one's intended to skip, so when it cuts those little marks in your fabric, you now have an opening to weave your chains over and under. Oh, perfect, you've got it right there, yes. So this little cutting blade, it's a skip rotary blade, and not only can you use it on here, but I do want to show you, this one is not. This one is also using that skip blade where we cut right along a twin needle, or using your wide cover stitch and tightening up your tension creates a tuck on your fabric, and then weaving that chain in and out of that cutting will just really dress up a plain old sweatshirt. But another place to use the chain is, as we did on this skirt, this is a very open weave fabric like an Osnaburg or a hand-loomed fabric, and we drew the threads out across the bottom and then took the chain and re-wove it into the area we pulled out the threads from. So like a drawn thread kind of work, Hardanger look. Okay, so some really different ways of using what's a plain old chain that comes out of the back of your machine, right? Just using a different thread, adjusting your tensions can give you a completely different look to that stitch. When you work with a chain stitch, or just as we looked at earlier, with the right side of your fabric facing up, you get a straight line stitching. And you also have the looper side by using a heavier thread, same stitch, just a completely different look. On the bag, and I'll pass that around, you can look at both sides of that. There's just stuff in there, don't worry about it. On on the bag, we've used, this is a pattern that actually I found on We All Sew. And it was designed just with strips of fabric that were gathered up, and I just added serger techniques to it. And the same foundation pattern, and just stitching with my chain stitch and using a variegated thread, the red, white, and blue, gathering using the ruffles, gathering the ruffles using the differential feed and the chain stitch. And when we work with these different threads, earlier I talked about blending threads together, where sometimes when you're working with, and as you saw on the bag, where the red, white, and blue line of stitching is very striped, right? Very, very stripy. And that's what we see in this green, white, and red thread on the left-hand side. To soften the look of any variegated thread, take your solid, any solid that's part of the variegation, and thread both threads through the same looper and treat it as one thread, okay? Does not jam it. Now, you're not going to take 2 8-weight threads and put it through. You can take 2 12-weight threads, and that's what this is, 2 12-weight threads, and put it through your upper or lower looper or your chain looper, okay? The last line of stitching that's on here is going to be taking 2 solid colored threads and threading them through your looper all at one time. And when you do that, then your threads change places every so often, and sometimes you see one color and sometimes you see the other color. And that's going to, again, expand the look and the way that you can use those other threads, as well as expand the look of your stitch. These were 12-weight threads. But now, if anybody in here do embroidery? Yeah. So you have all kinds of embroidery thread at home, right? You can blend up to 4 or 5 colors of embroidery thread through one looper. And you're like, how in the world do I put all the threads there? Well, remember these great little decorative thread spool pins that we used? That's why you want more than one. Because you can put, oh, where am I? Where am I? Can we see it? Oh, there we are. But we can't see it because it's white. Let me go over here. Oh, in front of my sweater. Oh, here we go. You girls are so smart. So this little decorative spool pin, when you hook it onto the side of your machine and place it along with, correlate it with the looper that you're going to be working with, you could have a couple of these setting around on your machine. And let me see. Leave it on here for just a second, and then we're going to come over to the little camera. Oh, I got to do that. So let me cut my thread. And I'm going to take this green thread and let me take a black thread. Oh, wait, yeah, that's good. Okay, let me back up. Okay, now, right here, yep. Let me just pull this other thread out. Okay. All right, so we're going to put this through our upper looper. So up here at the top, I have the black on the horizontal spool pin, and I have the green thread on the looper, vertical, thank you, spool pin. And I'm going to take the thread. Yeah. I'm going to snap it into the snapping thread guide here at the top. Now these two threads, the black one and the green one, are now being treated like one thread. So now when I bring it through the thread guide, okay, now you see the two threads that are there, and I'm going to pull a long length of thread, and I'm also going to take a regular length of thread, or regular cone thread, and I'm making a really long lasso with it. Okay, this is called a thread cradle. Okay, this is a thread cradle. Then we're going to activate our threading, and I'm going to take the two cut ends of the thread, and I'm going to make sure you hold on to the loop or it'll send it all right through. Take the end, put it into that threading port, and it sends it all through. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the thread right through using this little lasso. So I take the lasso, put my thread through the loop, and then when I pull on it, it's going to pull all the way through the machine. Okay? I'm trying to get my... Okay, that's... Yes, so with that thread cradle, the thread cradle, you can cradle through various types of threads if you're going to be blending or if you're going to be using heavier weights of thread that don't necessarily go through that threading area or threading nozzle. You can then also use this bypass, which is going to allow you to use a heavier weight of thread. Okay, so there's the end of the thread. I take the loop, pull my thread through. And then I grab onto this. Oh. Of course, and I pulled it all out. So you can see that it'll pull all the way through using that little lasso. Okay, so that's using two different threads. So now let's come back to our PowerPoint. And when we look at the chain stitch, so we looked at the overlock stitch using those blended threads, you can do the same thing with your chain thread and using the chain looper. So that red, white, and blue thread that we looked at earlier that was very, very stripy. On this sample, you can see how much softer it is by simply blending a red thread along with the red, white, and blue thread. So it just softens the look of that variegation. Okay? Now, just as we had used the overlock stitch to create the ruffles, the Serger crochet, you can also take a water-soluble mesh like you would use for making lace on your embroidery machine. And you can do row after row of stitching on top of that with your chain and cover stitches. And then what we did is we had taken this fabric, and actually Nancy Bednar made this flower. She made the fabric first on the water-soluble stabilizer. mesh. Then she took that piece of fabric and made this freestanding flower using an embroidery design on her embroidery machine. So now, just as Linda said earlier, you're making your own fabrics. And here, then when you rinse out your water-soluble stabilizer, you don't wash all of it out so that you have some extra support in those stitches so that they have body and they can support the edging that you have from your embroidery machine. So this is also a serger chain, or it's called serger lace. And you make this also by using this water-soluble mesh and a layer of mesh, a layer of tulle, and then another layer of mesh on top of that. And then as you stitch with your chain stitch, the stitches remain in the tulle. And then when you wash away the stabilizer, you end up with these stitches just floating right on top of your mesh. Now, or tulle. Now, if you're fortunate enough to use English cotton netting, okay, cotton netting, you don't have to use the stabilizer because that netting is supportive enough that it's going to hold those stitches. But again, this is using a chain stitch, and I like to snip things out of Pinterest or different things I see online, or you see it on your phone and you take a picture, just like you would take pictures out of a magazine and throw them in a folder. So I've taken pictures where I just saw a dress where it has the sleeves are all cut in one with the bodice, and the whole top of the bodice is like very lacy, and the bottom of the dress is just plain. So I thought, whoa, this would be a great technique, and you could add that. That could be the top of your dress, or it could be sleeves on a little girl's dress, or any place. Statement sleeves are so very popular right now. Miriam, you had those great statement sleeves on the other day that we were talking about statement sleeves and how this is a great way of creating your own fabric and making then some very statement pieces. Now, shadow work is also something that can be created on your serger by using a wide cover stitch, and also a very bright colored thread in your chain looper. So by using that bright colored thread in your chain looper, you're actually seeing the shadow of the chain looper because your fabric is very opaque, either a batiste or an organza or something that's very light in that it shadows through, you can see through it. Texture, yes. And also, this placemat here will combine both the wide cover stitch for shadow work, as well as, which is red, and then the green lines that are on there using the chain stitch, decorative thread in our chain looper. And then when you stitch, again, upside down. This little dress combines both differential feed as well as the wide cover stitch. So it looks like little pleats that have been created on the fabric. And then when I stitched, and I love that, and I didn't know this on my 790 plus, that I could have taken all of these decorative stitches and made them triple stitches so it would look like they were handwork on top of this line of stitching. So, when we buy sewing machines, we're like, oh, how many stitches does it have? And it's like 1,000 stitches, different stitches it has, and we use 3, right? So this is a great way to use your decorative stitches and also combine your machines together, creating the pleated fabric using your differential feed and a wide cover stitch. Now for the slip, I wanted to make the little slip inside, but I didn't have fabric and that had a nice edging, nor did I have time to embroider the bottom of a strip of fabric. So I had this strip of embroidered edging, and I simply took my flat lock stitch and added it to a piece of batiste, and then added 2 more rows so that it looked like it was supposed to be there. So it doesn't look like it's added on. I always say that with any of our serger stitchings, they need to become part of our end result. You don't want it to look like it was added, nor do you ever want to make it look like your serger has just thrown up stitches all over your piece of fabric. Okay? You want them to be applied so that when your friends and family look at something, they go, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you made that." Rather than going, "Oh yeah, I know you made that." Mm-hmm. Okay? I'm going to toss that your way. Okay. So this is just a little close-up of using that differential feed and the wide cover stitch, and then also using the piping foot, as you can see, for that trim that we have on the top and the bottom of the bodice. Okay? Now, the little christening gown is using Texture Magic, and Texture Magic on the back side of your fabric, back side, wrong side of the fabric, you have your decorative thread in your chain looper, and you're just stitching straight lines of stitching on your fabric. Then when you take your Laura Star Steam on the ironing system and you steam it, it's just going to shrink up the fabric so it looks like it has a little bit of texture and a little pleating that's on there as well. So using this same stitch, the narrow cover stitch, on the bottom of the skirt, it's very sheer and it doesn't pucker it, it doesn't draw it up, it just applies the stitch and it's exactly the same stitch, okay? The bonnet, the exact same way, okay? Now this is one of the By Annie patterns, and she shows you how to take these stitches or the Texture Magic and use your sewing machine stitches, and I'm like, well, we can do that on our serger, and we can actually add some additional detail by using the chain stitch and a decorative thread. And that's, again, just a 12-weight thread that we've placed on there, okay? This is also a By Annie's pattern using the Texture Magic for the band on the bag. But when I created the handle, instead of taking the fabric and having to turn it right side out and then do top stitching, I simply took the Soft and Stable, I wrapped the fabric around the strip of fabric, and then I used my cover stitch, my wide cover stitch, and stitched right over that raw edge to hold it in place. Yeah, easy. And then, so it didn't look like it was just a stitch added on there because I didn't have time to turn it or too lazy to turn it. Then I just added another line of chain stitching on either side so that it looks more decorative, okay? And using your chain stitch for top stitching along the outside, and I think I have a picture of this coming up a little more closely so you can see it. But by stitching this time, stitching so that the right side of your fabric is, again, facing down, and that way when you stitch it, you end up with that heavier chain stitch on the outside of your bag. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, to make straps or when, sure. Just if you would, make sure your pens are clicked closed. The pen, your pen.
Oh, okay.
A pen. Now, I've lived in Texas for a little while. I try not to have a twang, but someone told me that that Southern is a much more economical language. Yeah, because you can say pen, and it means either a writing device, it means where a livestock live, or it's also something you stick into fabric, okay? Now, a wide cover stitch, are we back? Yes, we're back on our screen, and you can see how when we used the cover stitch here, and as we crisscrossed over some of those lines, we cut little windows into our fabric. You could put another colored fabric behind it, or you could leave it open, but it again could be a very decorative effect on a sweatshirt. You know, sometimes we just like to have a little something, and this just allows you to be much more creative with it. Now, Gail, again, created this pattern or this sample, and here you will be able to see that she's actually blended 4 of the embroidery threads so that you can see how the colors kind of shift and change when it's going to be stitched. Taking just a flat surface, and you probably have a number of 2.5-inch squares that you might not have used in a project, right? So here I've just simply put a, what did she call that earlier? It was, I called it heat and bond. Applique Wonder. There we go. So take Applique Wonder, put that on the back of your 2.5-inch squares, fuse them all down, and then I just simply took my wide cover stitch and I just stitched so it looked like they were all pieced together. That's it. That's all I did. Okay? It makes it so much easier. And there again, I just used a variegated thread because it blended with the colors that I was working with.
There's a product called Applique Fuse. A lot of you have it for your scanning cuts. We sell it in here, and that would be a perfect product for it.
Yeah.
Applique Fuse.
Okay, Applique Fuse, another one. That's a good one to know. Okay, I like how you can take the chain and cover stitching and you can just add texture to any plain fabric. And I really, on this one, we've actually taken that chain and just covered a button, just a covered button. I wrapped fabric around it, and then I took a glue and glued that chain right on top of that covered button, creating the texture. I love how the look that we have on here, where all of those lines start to intersect with each other, and it does give you a very textural area. If you come to an event, sometimes you'll end up getting a tote bag, or you'll get a bag that you can use that in your machines. When we stitched our bags to the little Technique pouches, I know some of you were like, oh wow, is my serger going to sew through that poly mesh? And it just motors right through it because we have a DC motor on the machine, one, and also because of the length of those feed dogs helping it pull through. And here we just simply took a tote bag and we repurposed it and made it into this little carrier. And we used the needle side of our stitch facing up. This was completely constructed using the chain stitch. So we stitched with the needle side facing up, inserted our zippers. This is a zipper by the yard. And I think they just told me they're getting some of the Sally Tomato zippers by the yard. And that's what this is. They were like, oh my goodness, you can sew through a metal zipper. I'm like, no, it's plastic. So you can sew right through that and then top stitch. So you're not having to worry about your zippers not zipping and unzipping because you're completely constructing it with a chain stitch. Now here's another those of you that were in class, I'll take this one right away too. Those of you that were in class the other day, you still have a wide section of the bottom of our pouch that we made. So now you can also use those zippers by the yard, and you can cut the width, that whatever you want, and you can insert your zipper with the chain stitch or the overlock stitch, and then you can do another bag. Okay, you've got a part of that bag already there for you to work with. Okay, so this was the bottom of my original bag. Now the other pattern that I just want to share with you also, this was the very first project I made with the 890. And when I started with Bernina just about a year ago, they said, okay, we want you to test out the machines. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. And I made this bag. And through that, I sent them the results. And they're like, I thought you would just sew on like pieces of fabric. I'm like, well, no, because that's not really how we all sew, right? So here I used all the different stitches on the machine. And I used again, just a tote bag that I cut apart. And this is the chain stitch, crosshatch chain stitching. Then I also used the chain stitch for gathering my puffing like we did on our little bag on this side. On this side, I used the overlock stitch, and I can adjust my tension, thread control, on my needles, and I can add more control and gather more, and that you cannot do on other combo machines because they don't have that total thread control. So then we also did the chain stitching with the blended threads, 3-thread flat lock stitch, and 2-thread. And we wove those ribbons through on the back side. So that is another, I would suggest that the girls here at the store look at this and maybe use it as a club project so you can gather all back together. And 1 month you focus on blending threads. Another month you focus on 2-thread flat lock again. Because I know you're all going to go home, you're all going to remember absolutely everything that we worked in class today.
What did you use in the bag to make it stiff?
Inside, this is called that Annie's Soft and Stable. Is that what you carry here? Yeah, the Annie's Soft and Stable. And it's just an inner foam, and I love to use that. Now, I forgot to tell you this. This is another place that I like to use the fusible thread. So when I put my lining in my bag, I'll sew the top of my lining in using the fusible thread again in my lower looper, stitch my bag around, then when I tuck my lining in and I press, now my lining is pressed in place all the way around the top of the bag. So now when I top stitch, it's going to be held in place. So when I top stitch, it doesn't kind of curl out.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you've been talking about Bernina for a few times, and I don't know if you guys know, with Sue Ellen, that's in the other room, and Jane, we actually have a virtual class for Bernina projects. Every month we're doing a new bag of her.
Oh, fantastic.
And you can refer it back in the past, and they're available online if you're interested. Sorry.
Okay, good. Oh, that's very good to know. Okay. So that's that. Now, I'm not going to toss this one out because it's filled with, there's stuff inside of there. Okay. Now, the other project that I have here, we're back to I'm sorry, Nick. I keep bouncing back and forth. The placemats that I did, and these were actually done raw edge applique. So again, your cutting systems, you cut out your shape, fuse it down, and then I used the narrow cover stitch, but having the needle side facing up, and it looks like twin needle work going across the center section of the project, okay? So you are able to use both sides. Then using and stitching with vinyl, you don't have any trouble stitching on the vinyl, as we looked at several of these different projects because of the length of the feed dogs that you have and the pull that it comes through using the DC motor. And then also, that's just the close-up of that little bag, that the handles that we were talking about earlier. Now, one last thing I do want to share with you is many of you I know are quilters, and the big question always is, well, you know what, I'm a quilter, so how am I ever going to use a serger? And as I told you earlier, I'm not a real quilter, but I do like to piece and quilt. Now, I do send my quilts away for someone else to use their long arm. Their Bernina long arm. Actually, it's a Bernina educator that does it for me, so that's fabulous. And when I made this little quilt, and it's all flannel, a couple of things I want you to keep in mind is, first, you can use either your straight stitch, which is your chain stitch, and because you have the markings that are on your foot, you can get an exact 1/4 of an inch as you stitch. For this flannel quilt, I did use a narrow 4-thread overlock stitch because it's going to ensure that whenever I do give this quilt away to somebody, that when it's used or even when I'm demoing with it, it's not going to pull apart. That flannel isn't going to pull out the seams. So the 5.5 millimeter stitch width that you have on your width dial, you can set and be assured that you have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So again, this whole quilt, other than the long arm quilting, was completely done with my serger. So I pieced it, did all of my strip piecing, then I cut it apart, then I re-pieced my blocks together. And for the ruffle, I did use the soft lock in my upper looper so that when I stitched, that edge was going to be a little bit thicker, a little more dense, but I didn't have to have my stitch length so close together. Because when you work with your rolled hem, sometimes if your rolled hem is too close together and your fabric is perforated, your stitch will fall right off the edge. So again, it's important to use like a soft lock thread or a little heavier thread so your stitch spacing can be a little bit longer and it doesn't perforate the edge of your fabric. And then we just used the differential feed and stitched right through the middle of that ruffle and then set differential feed back to the normal or number 1 setting, and then I could stitch this back in place. And the quilt, the binding that was on here was a self-binding. So I could take the fabric edge, just wrap it around, and then top stitch. I could either use at that point, I could have either used my chain stitch, which I did, or I could have used the narrow cover stitch if I didn't want to double turn my edge. Okay, so it can be sealed off. Yes?
And that can be done on like a Macy or that double
Uh-huh.
also, okay?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Now, so when your question was, can we use that technique for Minky? And yes, absolutely. So now the thing with working with Minky is that when you're cutting using your serger and you're piecing it together, you're going to have a lot of lint and fuzz. You really do need to wear a mask when you're sewing with that Minky sometimes. But it's also very important that you clean out your machine pretty regularly when you're stitching with Minky, because you'll find that your cutting blade, if there's a lot of lint that continues to rub inside between those blades, it will dull the blades faster than if you keep it clean. Okay? Take your little vacuum or a little brush and brush it out. And that's going to keep it much neater, and it's also going to help the length of the life of your cutting blades as well. Okay? All righty. Oh, well, any other questions? No? Okay. So what time are we at here? 3:30? 3:30. Okay. Now then, I just wanted to, I'm going to X out of this. And for those of you that are online, I'm going to run through this really very quickly and share with you what we were working on the machines today. So with the L890s, we do have the touch screens that are here on the machine itself, which is going to be very interactive like you have on your sewing machines. But also what you have is a guided mode and an expert mode. And this guided mode, we were all joking, but seriously, this is like having Mary sitting right next to you. So that when you're moving between the different stitches, it will take you through step by step on making the adjustment to the stitch, and you follow along. It's like having a built-in instruction book right here for you. And whether you're needing to know how to position your needles, how to change the needles, what differential feed is or does, all of these videos are going to be built right in on the machine for you. So it really does give you all of the information that you're going to be needing right here inside of the machine. And as you read through these, just making the adjustment to the machine at the time that you see it on the screen. Even to the point of threading. So when you're going to be threading, if you're not exactly sure, you just simply touch on that video and it will show you how to thread your machine. So there's really no reason that we're not going to now change between our different stitches, because it's all right there, and it's going to show you exactly what we're going to be doing, how we need to do it. We have full control. Those of you that have been in class, you experienced how we have full control over our stitch. So we control how the stitch looks rather than the machine controlling how they feel we should be using that stitch. So we have full control over that by making the adjustment. And then anytime we would want to, and we're just kind of playing with these for an example, once you would have that stitch set, you can then go to the favorites and you can touch the pocket to save it into memory. And you can then label it by thread weight or by technique. And you can label it up to 40 different characters on the screen. And then when you touch save, it automatically saves all of those changes, even to the point of changing your speed. So one thing we didn't mention is when we're sewing with heavier threads, you do want to sew at a little more slow speed. So if you would come in and you would make the adjustment to the speed of your machine, when you touch the favorites and you save it, it also saves the speed at which that stitch would be sewn out at. Okay, so even if you would have, maybe you have a friend that you're going to be sewing with, or a grandson or a granddaughter, and, you know, they're much more adventurous sometimes than we are, right? Oops. And we're back. So sometimes they're more adventurous. So what we could do is we could come in here and you could label this stitch. We're just going to type in Kelly. If I can find the letters. Kelly. Okay. So now if you would say, let's say your granddaughter's coming over and she's going to be sewing and she goes, what stitch do I use? You go, you use the Kelly stitch. Okay? Okay? And that way you could label it for their own stitches so that you could set the speed for them. And they wouldn't regulate the speed. It would be their stitch. And that way, it kind of helps build the confidence as well. And sometimes even for ourselves, there are places we want to sew fast and other places we don't want to sew quite so fast. So it really does open a whole different world of, like I said, taking our sergers beyond the edge. And I think in the last few days, we've really seen how you can, how the machine that was originally designed years ago, taken from an industrial factory and brought into the home for home use, for garment construction and finishing of our seams, has taken a giant leap into the 21st century and being able to use it in a very creative way that all of us like to take our sewing machines, and really, if we think about it, our sewing machines sew a straight stitch, right? And look at all the great things that we do with those stitches. And we can do the same thing with our sergers as well. So, if anybody has any additional questions, I'm more than happy to answer those questions. And if there are questions that people might have online, they could certainly ask those questions and we'd be happy to answer the questions for you too. Oh, I did want to show you, Linda was mentioning about the cabinet earlier. And let's see, let me go back to, I'm there. So here we have a picture of the cabinet. This is a Serger cabinet that has an electric lift because there's also a free arm that's on the machine that you can raise and lower the machine in this cabinet when you're wanting to access your free arm. And it also has storage on the side. The bottom, what looks like a drawer, is actually a door. So when you open it, there's a shelf that pulls out and you have places for storing all of your cone threads. There's 2 shelves that are in there for storing your cone threads and decorative threads there as well. The other cool thing is not only does it have this flat surface, but on the back side, there's a gate leg and it swings up. So you have a depth, again, that you could use as a cutting table. And if you are a quilter and you're going to be piecing or you're needing more surface area, you can, to put junk on. You certainly have more place to do that with that gate leg that pulls up on the back side. So that is part of the promotion, I think, that they were talking about, that you can take a look at that. Let's see, is there anything else that I haven't shared with you? Big Book of Serging, we talked, yes. These egg placemats? Okay, so these egg placemats are strips of fabric. Just you take strips of fabric, zip, zip, zip. You could make them oval, you could make them square, you could do whatever shape you wanted. Strip, 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 flat lock. Then I took the Timtex or Peltex or, a stiff, and I fused it on the back, solid on the back, my strip pieced on the front, and then I just took my 3-thread overlock and stitched all the way around. And that was it. Now, when you do that, the trick to doing this is that you don't want to necessarily use your 9mm wide stitching when you go around a curve, because it's wide and it's harder to turn a curve. It's harder to turn a corner with a Winnebago bus than it is a Volkswagen Bug, right? So the same thing applies with your stitching. If your stitch is too wide, it's going to be harder to maneuver around. But you do have the freehand system that you can stitch and pivot. You have your foot pedal where you have needle up and down that you can pivot, and you have a much more you have a greater chance of stitching on a nice curve than you did before, rather than getting in a hexagon or stop sign shape. Now the other, can we just go over, Nick, to the little camera real quick? So I have to escape. There we go. Okay. So now, when you're, let me see if I can get this out and. Okay, anybody have questions while I get this rethreaded? 12 weight. Yeah, nothing nothing really heavier than a 12 weight that you would blend together. Now, you can go lighter weight, but you don't really want to go any heavier than that 12 weight. Okay, I'm going to show you just real quick. And Linda, if you're wanting to, oh, sorry, Nick. Okay.
While Pam is doing that, all I wanted,
No, go ahead. Oh. I think, are you on mute?
okay, I guess you can hear now, thanks. First of all, while Pam is doing this, I do want you to know that we have got a couple of teachers in the room that have been very definitely looking at these projects, especially this wonderful tote bag and some of these and quite a few of these things. So there will be a lot of support. And this will be for people that already own the 890. If we taught a bag class, a biannie tote maybe that Sue Ellen, you and Jane have done, how many would take it? Well, watch that, guys. How many would like, there's 1, 2, 3 over here. How many over here? Well, there's at least 4 or 5 over here. Can somebody bring up Sue Ellen's tote that she did there that's going to be the bag of the month for this year? It was sitting right by the side with the quilt. Sue Ellen, do you see it there? Yeah, I want to bring it up because I want to show you what, and I can feel it in here that you use the soft and stable too. Mm-hmm. And this is the soft and stable that is for the bag of the month for this year.
This is the May one, so this is what we taught in May.
Okay, maybe I can just show it up here because this would be delightful if we did a tote bag similar to what Pam was doing. Mm-hmm. And we did it with the decorative threads.
Yep.
Wouldn't that be phenomenal?
Now, if I had known about the fusible thread before,
I would have demonstrated that using, so for the next demo, we're going to be demoing using the fusible thread.
Okay. And inside, where is the little bag that's, or is this Jane's?
this is Jane's.
Okay, there's another one that, whoops, okay. Let's bring it over here so you can see it. There, isn't that gorgeous? And then we have
This is the May
another,
project, and then there's a small bag that is also 2 for 1 month with 2 different patterns in the package.
This is a 2 for 1 month where in the pattern, there are 2 different patterns. And so there's also a small little bag that.
I mean, they're just lovely. There's so many things that we can do. And what Pam has really showed us here in the seminar for these
This
2
is a
days.
by Annie's also.
Oh my gosh.
This
look
is
at
a
this.
placemat by Annie's also.
Oh, this is just
And you
darling.
know, when you say about by Annie, I contacted Annie. She's a Bernina ambassador.
Right.
And she and I are going to start working a little more closely together where I'm taking her patterns and sergifying them, helping her understand how
Wow.
we can use her patterns and including serger directions.
Oh, that's fabulous. Okay, are you ready to
Okay.
go there? So when you signal me when you're ready, when you're final ready
Like,
to
you can stay right here.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. So here's what I want to show you real quick. So what I've done is I have decorative thread in my upper and lower looper, and they are individual. They're not threaded together. So I have one in the upper and one in the lower.
And this is what's so fun, when you can take all these decorative threads and do something with them. I mean, I know many of you have these at home. This would be a great way for you to really try to work and find some really fun things. Make some samples.
Yeah.
Hey Pam, there's a question from one of the persons on the
Chat?
Zoom. She asks, how many needles and how many loopers? And is there a stitch that uses all needles and loopers?
Yes. How many needles and how many loopers? So how many loopers? You have up to 3. Time. You have 5 needles that you're working with, that are in your machine, and you can work with up to 3 of those needles at one time. Okay? Now, when you do that, you're working with a combo stitch that we looked at the very beginning of class, where we have those combo stitches that you can use for seaming and overlocking all at the same time. Okay, but what I wanted to just share with you real quick, you were asking about going around a curve. So when you go around these curves and we're stitching, first your serger always stitches on a straight edge, right? Now, when I get to a point where I can't turn it anymore, that's where my knee lift comes into position. I don't have it because it's backed up, but I can also stop with my needle down, raise the foot, and pivot my fabric. So now I have that ability to come around the curve a lot better than if I didn't have that needle down and freehand system. Okay, I'm just gonna come around.
Unbelievable. Do you see what she's doing, guys?
Okay, and just pivot. And so you have that needle up and down. You can pivot every so many stitches like you do on your sewing machine, so that you can get a nice round edge rather than that hexagon. So now as we come around the corner, I'm going to clip off the beginning threads. All right, so I'm coming around. Can you see that? Now,
Very well.
I'm going to raise the foot and turn it out of the way so I can see where I'm coming
Oh my gosh.
up to that line of stitching where I stopped, where I need to stop. And also, did you notice that I don't have to pivot the foot in? I can just lower the foot and it goes right in all by itself.
Mary, did you see that?
Okay, so when I come around and I'm overlapping my stitches, I can easily, remember, push away the cutting blade, overlap the stitches, just a couple of stitches, stop with my needle up, raise the foot, turn it all the way out, and stitch off.
Oh my gosh, you guys, you have no
Okay.
idea. There's no other serger that does this. Unbelievable. This is unbelievable.
This tool, oh yeah, that tool, that hooky, you can bring the tail and you can pull it in. Yeah.
Every serger person should own one of those.
Yeah. This is if you're doing a placemat like this where you don't want to have what I call the on-ramp stitching and the off-ramp stitching, okay? So this eliminates that off-ramp stitching of diagonal stitching off the edge of your fabric.
That is probably the most.
I think you have pulled everything out of me. Not really. Huh? Oh, yeah. So Betsy said, oh, you know what they should do is get a place for these little hookies to be placed. Well, because there's that magnet on the side of your machine for your stylus, you can attach that little hookie on the side of your machine.
Unbelievable.
So I think that's fantastic. And this is why we all get together, so we learn from each other, for
Gosh,
sure.
I love it. You guys, those of you that are really seasoned serger people, this right here, what she showed you, and the way she did that with that foot out of the way so you can see what she's doing, the on and off ramp term is just phenomenal. That right there, she's amazing. Let's give her a huge round.
Thank you. I love it. I love to come and spend time out here with all of you, and honestly, I get just as inspired being with all of you as you do with me. And you know, I always end all of my programs with this because I truly believe this, that when we make things, we give a part of ourselves with everything that we make and everything that we give. Linda gives a part of herself because of her store, and I give a part of myself to you, having been with you for the last few days, and hope that that knowledge that you have gained will resonate, and you'll be able to share that with other people as well. Okay?
Oh, thanks again.
I've never taken any workshops here. This has to be one of the most well-organized.
Oh, Carolyn, thank you.
It's like in a stratosphere.
Oh, you guys.
Well, good.
You guys are
good.
so wonderful. I really mean that. That's why we do this. This is just, so now we have a flash sale for you. And anything that's on that card is 50% off. So go have it, go at it. Don't forget these beautiful, there's new kits over there that are fun. I think they're like $9
And
or
ladies,
something.
if you would cut your threads off of just cut the threads off. If you brought your machines, just cut the threads and leave them on the table there.
Because those are
And-
all her threads, okay? If you
Yeah,
would.
we'll just
Pam
pick-
even brought her own thread for you. So if you just cut the thread off so we can take them out. And don't forget these wonderful Serger prices, because Mr. John Carr, we didn't even bring you up here. Come here. Mr. Carr is one of the most well-known, loved people from Bernina, and we are so fortunate to have him here. Those of you that are still on Zoom, you need to know that because John
I know Linda gave you all a very great deal with these. If you love them, you're going to get the best training. And something you may or may not know is that when Bernina was building these Sergers, we selected 2 or 3 dealers in the country to help test and design them. Mary, well, I'm re-emphasizing it though, but Mary Childers and Linda, they got a piece of themselves in this as Pam was talking about it. So, and Linda, you do a great job as always. One of our best dealers. It's a pleasure to work with her. And I know a lot of you, and it's always fun to see you. And won't it be great when we don't have to wear masks?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great one, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Enjoy those great bargains back there. Hope you can seriously think about these tables and these machines and come to training. The worst thing that can happen is you buy one of these beautiful machines and you don't come to our training.
I was told